Einen schönen guten Abend, ein herzliches Willkommen auch im Namen von Frau Marianne Hambach-Steins. Wir haben den Gastvortrag organisiert. Herzlich willkommen hier. Es freut mich sehr, dass so ein großer und sehr diverser Kreis hier ist, um Massimo Faggioli zu hören. Wir werden auch für die Menschen, die jetzt nicht heute Abend hier sein können, das nochmal aufzeichnen und digital zugänglich machen. Die Kamera wird nach dem Vortrag von Herrn Faggioli ausgeschaltet werden, sodass wir dann auch die Freiheit der offenen Rede haben in der Diskussion. Am 29. Januar 2025 vertrat US-Vizepräsident J.D. Vance in einem vielbeachteten Fox News-Interview eine rechtspopulistische Auslegung des augustinischen Konzepts des Ordo Amoris. Kurz darauf repostete Kardinal Robert Francis Prevost, inzwischen Papst Leo XIV., zustimmend einen Kommentar mit dem Titel, ich übersetze, J.D. Vance liegt falsch. Jesus fordert uns nicht zu einer abgestuften Liebe für andere auf. Szenenwechsel. Am 4. März 2025 hielt Donald Trump seine erste Rede zur Lage der Nation als 47. Präsident der Vereinigten Staaten. Bischof Robert Barron, der die Zeremonie als Ehrengast eines republikanischen Senators erlebte, kommentierte kurz darauf auf Instagram, er sei in höchstem Maße delighted. Auch wenn die Rede des Präsidenten ziemlich rough gewesen sei, so hätten sich die Demokraten doch viel schlimmer verhalten, weil sie die Political Liturgy der Feier nicht angemessen gewürdigt hätten. Diese US-Diskurskonstellation, Kardinal Prevost über Vizepräsident Vance und Bischof Barron über Präsident Trump, spannt ein hochaktuelles politisch-kirchliches bzw. kirchenpolitisches Problemfeld auf, in dessen Vorgeschichte wir uns heute Abend bewegen werden. Und auf dem gerade angesichts der baldigen Verleihung des Münsteraner Josef-Pieper-Preises an Bischof Barron nicht wenig Spannung liegt. Ich könnte mir keinen besseren theologischen Reiseführer in dieses global bedeutsame Problemfeld des US-Katholizismus vorstellen als Massimo Faggioli, den ich heute Abend hier in unserer Mitte sehr, sehr herzlich begrüßen darf. Massimo Faggioli wurde 1970 im schönen italienischen Ferrara geboren. Theologie studierte er dort, aber auch in Bologna, Tübingen und Turin, wo er 2002 mit der Dissertation Il Vescovo e il Concilio, Modello Episcopale e Aggiornamento al Vaticano II promoviert wurde. Von 1996 bis 2008 leistete Massimo Faggioli konzilstheologische Forschungsarbeit an der Fondazione per le Scienze Religiose in Bologna. Er ist also Teil jener berühmten Alberigo-Schule der Erforschung des Zweiten Vatikanischen Konzils. 2009 folgte er einem Ruf in die USA, an die University of St. Thomas in St. Paul, Minnesota. 2016 wechselte er nach Philadelphia an die Villanova University der Augustiner, an der auch der heutige Papst studiert hatte. 2018 erhielt er ein Ehrendoktorat der Sacred Heart University in Fairfield, Connecticut. 2023 wurde er in den herausgebenden Kreis der internationalen theologischen Zeitschrift Concilium gewählt. Massimo Faggioli gilt als einer der weltweit führenden Experten für die Geschichte des Zweiten Vatikanischen Konzils. Er ist Mitherausgeber des Oxford Handbook of Vatican II und Mitglied im Steuerungskomitee des interkontinentalen Kommentarprojekts Vatican II Event and Mandate, dessen erste Bände gerade auf Deutsch erschienen sind und in dessen Kontext wir beide nun schon seit 2017 zusammenarbeiten. Als prominente Gegenstimme zum ebenso finanzstarken wie einflussreichen US-Rechtskatholizismus gilt Massimo Faggioli als einer der wichtigsten katholischen, öffentlichen Intellektuellen in den USA. Als Kolumnist kommentiert er regelmäßig für Il Regno in Bologna und für das Commonweal Magazine in New York die aktuelle Kirchen- und Weltlage. Sein weit ausgespanntes Themenspektrum reicht vom Zweiten Vatikanum über das nachkonziliare Papsttum und den globalen Katholizismus bis hin zu den internen Dynamiken der katholischen Kirche in den USA. Ich nenne nur 3 exemplarische Buchtitel aus der letzten Zeit. The Liminal Papacy of Pope Francis, Moving Toward Global Catholicity. Dann Joe Biden and Catholicism in the United States. und ganz frisch, fast noch druckfrisch, Da Dio a Trump, Crisi Cattolica e Politica Americana. Massimo Faggioli wird gleich auf Englisch zu uns sprechen. Beim anschließenden Austausch kann jede und jeder von Ihnen allerdings die Sprache wählen, die ihm oder ihr in diesem Zusammenhang am leichtesten fällt. Gerne auch Italienisch. Massimo Faggioli jedenfalls versteht seit seiner Tübinger Studienzeit exzellent Deutsch. Dear Massimo, most welcome to Münster. The floor is yours.
Meine Damen und Herren, sehr geehrte Kolleginnen und Kollegen, I'm going to speak in English. It's a great honor to be here. I'm not sure I deserve that introduction, but I'm very grateful to be here, to be back in Germany, and at this university, which means a lot for Catholic theology, not just in Germany, but worldwide. I feel I'm coming home, leaving America just a few weeks ago. There is surely a problem with American democracy, which is also a religious problem, a theological problem. There are surely authoritarian movements, fascistic kind of instincts going on. You know all that. My attempt tonight will be to go a little deeper and to take a few steps back, 4 decades more or less, and to analyze what is the theological problem that concerns Catholicism, especially in the United States. But as we all know, what happens in the United States doesn't stay in the United States. It tends to spread, it tends to be marketed or acquired willingly in the global church. So when we talk about Catholic moment, we have to understand the meaning of that definition, which goes back to a very important book that was written it was published in 1987 by one of the most important public intellectuals for the role of Christianity in the US in the post-Vatican II period, Richard John Newhouse, a Lutheran pastor who converted to Catholicism shortly after writing that book of 1987, and he became the founder of the neoconservative movement, theologically speaking, in North America. And after his conversion to Catholicism and after the foundation of the magazine First Things, it has really given voice to a new kind of Catholic culture relating to the public square, to politics, to the American Constitution, to the American project. So Newhouse doesn't come from nothing, because he, in some sense, what he called in that book that was titled The Catholic Moment, is something that starts already after World War II, when Catholics started to be more accepted in America. Their rise in society, in the economic system, the election of John Kennedy in 1960. So there's been a long Catholic moment. But Newhouse's book was very important in saying one thing that really changed the perspective of many Catholics in the US, looking at what America was in the 1980s and still influences what America is today or what is becoming. So here, Newhouse said in 1987 that to understand America, the problem of America, you needed to understand how Catholicism relates to modernity, to modern culture. And here Newhouse worked on the book published by Richard Niebuhr in 1951, Christ and Culture, which presents a series of different options, okay, for how how Christianity relates to modern culture. One model is opposition to culture, Christ against culture. A second model is an agreement between Christianity and culture, or the Christ of culture. A third model was a combination of the first and of the second, which he called Christ above culture. And then he went on and he offered some other versions of that, a synthesis between Christianity and culture, a dualistic version, as a Christianity and culture not in opposition but clearly distinct. And then finally he said that there is a conversionist type of relationship between Christianity and modern culture that tries to look at Jesus as the converter of culture and society into a Christian model. So here Newhouse said that the Catholic movement in the United States had become much more important in the 80s, and remember the year 1980 is when politically Catholics started voting much less for the Democratic Party and more for the Republican Party, mostly because of the legalization of abortion at the federal level in 1973, but not only. So here Newhouse says, in these last 20 years especially, so 1987 back to Vatican II, we have seen that there is an erosion of the American Christian culture, and for that, Newhouse blamed largely the Second Vatican Council. Actually, not the Second Vatican Council itself, but certain interpretations of the Second Vatican Council. This is very important. It's a distinction. So he didn't blame Vatican II. Newhouse was on the record for being in favor of the liturgical reform of the Second Vatican Council. So he didn't attack Vatican II per se, but he said there have been some liberal interpretations of the Second Vatican Council that have eroded, have taken away the strength of Christianity and of Catholicism, especially from the ability to be a force for the conversion, for the purification, the cultural criticism of America. He was writing this book still as a Lutheran pastor, but it was a step towards his conversion, because he said in 87, and I quote here, he wrote, "The contest over the interpretation of Vatican II constitutes a critical battlefront in our society's continuing cultural wars," end quote. This is one of the truest and more disturbing things that I've learned in my 17 years in the United States. If you want to understand the problem between religion and politics, especially from a Catholic point of view, you just have to look at how different Catholics look at Vatican II in the United States. And you have a whole spectrum. So that's always a very important test of how much the positions have shifted from a recognition Vatican II good, some interpretations bad, to a more extremist interpretation of actually Vatican II was bad, or was naive, or was... So this is when the modern definition of Catholic moment got traction in the public square, because Newhouse in 1990, he founded First Things, which is the most important voice for neoconservative and in these last few years of Trumpian Catholicism. It's something that every smart intellectual who wants to understand America should read and take a look without dismissing that, because we have dismissed those voices for too long. We need to pay attention to that. Famously, the papal apartment of John Paul II had a subscription to First Things, and Newhouse was very happy about that. George W. Bush, President George W. Bush, had Richard John Newhouse as a consultor, as an advisor on bioethical issues, because, as you know, the bioethical issues were at the center of what we call the culture wars, right? That start with abortion in 1973, the legalization of abortion, and then they brew in the 80s and they explode in the 1990s. 1992 is a key year for the rise of the cultural wars within Christianity and between Catholics. 16 years after writing his book on the Catholic moment, Newhouse wrote in First Things, his magazine, an article titled "The Persistence of the Catholic Moment." So he said, after 16 years, I told you, I was right, because all these things have become even more important after 16 years. And 22 years after Newhouse's article of 2003, I think we are in a different kind of Catholic moment. And there's a paper trail. So when Christian invited me, we didn't know that we would have the first pope from the United States. So that has changed a little bit, but it's given more, material to my thinking here. So why we are in a new Catholic moment here, I think, in the United States? Because I think what has happened in these last 10, 15 years, and the election of Donald Trump and of J.D. Vance in November 2024 to the White House, is really the story of the rise of a new kind of Catholic culture, not just of a new kind of Catholic politicians, but a new kind of Catholic thinking about politics, about modernity, about society, about scripture, about sacraments, about community. Okay, so this has happened in these last few years, and I think that in its own way, the conclave of May 2025, which elected Pope Leo XIV, is a kind of a response or an intuition to this American Catholic moment in its own way. I think, so there are some similarities with what happened in 1978 with the election of John Paul II, a pope from Poland, even if history doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes, as we know. So here we have to look for this new phase of the Catholic moment at these last few years, which have created what I think, we all know, is in global politics the age of Donald Trump. It's not the age of whoever you have in mind, but it's the age of Donald Trump. The rise, the decision of Trump to enter politics dates 2015, just a few weeks before Pope Francis visited the United States. So, but there's a longer history there, because it's really part of the reaction against the election of Barack Obama in 2008. Early on, there is not just a reaction coming from the Tea Party, in which a certain kind of libertarian, free market Catholic culture plays a key role. The Lord Acton Institute, the Catholic libertarian movement, no government, only market, is a key element of this Catholic moment. But there's also what makes Donald Trump a national political figure, when then TV celebrity Donald Trump starts questioning in public the birthplace of Barack Obama. It's on the record. It was said many times that he wasn't born in the United States, he was born in Africa, and that is why his presidency was labeled as illegitimate. It was the beginning of what we have seen in January 2021 with the assault to Capitol Hill. It starts in 2009, and we have a certain kind of Catholic institutional movement of rebellion against the American political constitutional system. When Joe Biden, then Vice President, and President Obama, they pass the so-called Obamacare, the healthcare reform, there is a very strong reaction of the US Conference of Catholic Bishops that really sounds the alarm of an emergency, of a threat against the freedom of religion. It's the fourth night for freedom, which really sounds a national emergency on the government of Barack Obama, which is threatening the freedom of religion and of Catholics to refuse to implement some medical procedures that are in contradiction with Catholic teaching, especially bioethical issues. Then we have, in 2013, the beginning of the Black Lives Matter movement and the beginning of a Catholic split on that. I mean, Catholics who were labeled as woke Catholic for racial justice, social justice, gender equality, and so on, and the beginning of a reaction that dismisses or belittles that rise of consciousness of Catholicism as the largest church in the United States for what has been a multi-century long problem of racial inequality, of social inequality, of economic injustice, and so on. 2018 is the third phase in the global history of the sex abuse crisis in the Catholic Church, which has once again in the US the ground zero, or one of the ground zero, with the case of the former Archbishop of Washington, D.C., Theodore McCarrick, and the former papal nuncio to the United States in August 2018, publicly accusing Pope Francis of being an accomplice of an abuser and asking Pope Francis to resign in August of 2018. That is one part of the pieces in the Catholic rebellion against the papacy of Pope Francis, but also again the established order, political and ecclesiastical. Another moment, 2020, COVID-19, there is a very marginal but very militant movement within American Catholicism refusing vaccination, refusing masking, actually refusing science, and openly dissenting from the teaching of Pope Francis, of the bishops in every country, every continent, encouraging Catholics to be vaccinated and so on. That is part of a theological and political rebellion, which leads ultimately to the appointment of Robert F. Kennedy Jr. as the health secretary, the most famous anti-vaccine propagandist in the United States. And then 2024, with the end of the run of Joe Biden for a second term, that is the end of, I think, of a certain era within political Catholicism. Joe Biden is the last national politician who belongs to the generation of those who have come of age in that period around the 60s, around Vatican II. And you have that really sharp leap from a Catholic like Joe Biden to a Catholic like J.D. Vance. It's not just a generational leap, it's much more than that. And then we have, in January 2025, the beginning of the second term of President Trump, who has really redefined the relations between church and state in the United States, which, as you know, is understood as a separation, church and state, constitutional, the First Amendment. So, but there are so many areas in which the federal government and the churches and also Jewish organizations, they collaborate, and this has been put to a stop by and large by Donald Trump and Elon Musk, Doge, radical cuts to foreign aid, the attacks against the universities, what has been done against Harvard and Columbia is not just against Harvard and Columbia, it's a message for everyone, for every university, especially those who don't have a $50 billion endowment. And there is, by and large, a redefinition of what it means to live in the United States, especially if you're not a citizen. You are not sure what your rights are, really. If you have freedom of speech or not, if you have freedom to travel or not. This is a story of these last 4 months, which has changed the expectation of many people. We did not expect that kind of shock and awe campaign, which is targeting also the churches. The Jewish organizations work with migrants, with refugees. There's a Make America Great Again narrative which tries to tell that we can be great again if we bring God back into government, in legislation, but that's clearly happening at the cost of the freedom of Catholic organizations to speak, to operate on behalf of the government, on behalf of the American people. Now, just as an aside note, this is what happens, these are just some of the key dates and moments in these last 15 years in the United States, which is part of a larger issue within global Catholicism and within global politics, which is what happens in the Anglo-American world. So those are the years of Brexit, which is a political event in which some Catholic voices play a very important role. In the UK and in North America, actually hoping that Brexit succeeds because Europe has become the enemy. Europe has become the anti-model, politically, religiously, culturally, militarily, all of that. So that's for another talk some other time. So Brexit means in the UK what happens in the United States, a certain kind of populism, nationalism, the legitimization of the post-truth, and a debate on our constitutional systems, what is our constitution about, in which Catholics, both bishops, Catholic intellectuals and so on, they take positions that are at best ambivalent, not really clear, not univocal, not unanimous for sure. So here, I think that Newhouse in 1987 and in 2003 was a prophet because something has happened in the sense that Catholicism has become the most important voice within American religion to understand what's going on in the relations between America, its history, its rootedness in the country, its role theologically, intellectually, ritually. As you know, America is not just a country. I mean, the most important definition that was given to America was by Chesterton, who famously said, America is a nation with the soul of a church. It's a church more than a political constitution. So if you want to look at the trouble of America, you have to look at the trouble in American religion. All of them. But Catholicism now happens to be the largest, politically central. Just look at how many of the 9 justices on the bench of the Supreme Court are Catholic. 6 out of 9. I think the Pilgrim Fathers of 4 centuries ago would be horrified if they saw that. Knowing the long history of anti-Catholicism. I mean, this is a remarkable history of success. I mean, John Kennedy, in 1960, when he campaigns for president, he is repeatedly asked, how you, a Catholic, how can you be our president? Because you have a double loyalty. You will never be a real American. 1960. In all Protestant states. So it is a remarkable history of success. So Newhouse was right in that sense. What are the costs of this success? So I think, and here, let me be clear, I still see myself very much shaped by European culture, European theology. Tübingen, sorry, not Münster, Tübingen. Bologna, right? I spent many summers in my life in France as a teenager. So I still see America as something strange, okay? As something, an object that needs to be investigated, but with an eye that is a little on the side, okay? So I think there are some things that have happened in this Catholic moment that are part of these risks that American democracy is running on itself and on the global world. First, when Newhouse founded his movement and his magazine, it was I could say it was a right of center, theological understanding of the role of the church and of Christianity in modern society. Not an extremist one, a right of center. Looking to the right, but not a Lefebvrite, not for the Latin Mass, not a rejection of the Second Vatican Council. What we have seen in these last 10, 15 years is the mutation of that culture into something that is much closer to a neo-traditionalist. The church cannot change because it has never changed, kind of idea. Second, so there is a resurgence of a Catholic fundamentalism. So now, the usual way was to say, well, fundamentalism is a problem of Protestants because it's about Scripture. Catholics don't read Scripture, so they don't have this problem. Right? Now, there's an important book published a couple of months ago by a Jesuit historian at Boston College, Mark Massa, who goes through certain chapters of these last 80 years since the 1940s, and there's a history of Catholic fundamentalism, and those voices have expanded their reach, they have expanded their operation, in traditional media, on the internet, and so on. So there is a kind of Catholic fundamentalism which has become closer to this political moment in the United States. There is a recovery among some important thinkers that are closer to the Trump movement. They are Catholics of a 19th century or early 20th century integralism. Patrick Deneen at Notre Dame, very influential. Adrian Vermeule, with the chair at the Harvard Law School. So there is a sharp critique of liberal legalism, of the liberal order, and there's an open, or not less open, embrace of Carl Schmitt's ideas to articulate a vision of a Christian theocracy that suggests that the church is the only entity capable to give form to our political life as a resistance against technocracy, against the domination of global forces, and so on. It's a recovery of 19th century thinkers, anti-French Revolution, thinkers like de Maistre, Cortés, de Bonald. It's this idea that you could really see from some statements and some actions of the Trump government that the will of the people has to be seen as the will of God. And there's no constitutional system that can interfere with the will of God. No Supreme Court. The justice system should be deferential to the executive power much more than it has been. So this means an attack against what we meant, what we thought was the rule of law, the judiciary in its relationship with the executive power, the role of the free press, of the universities. If those who are in power are there for the will of God, what's the point of talking about conflict of interests or corruption? Deus le vult, it's God's will. It's a political theology that is really much more about Carl Schmitt than Johann Baptist Metz. Completely, this is a shocking thing. I mean, for me, it has been a shocking thing to see this. There is the rise of a very important stream of Catholic intellectuals in the legal movement, in the law schools. Law schools, they produce the future judges, the future politicians, prosecutors, and the Catholic Church has played a key role in the rise of the legal conservative movement, which has produced all this appointment of judges that are Catholic to the Supreme Court, especially by Republican presidents. And finally, what is really typical of the Trump II, which we didn't see in 2017, is an alliance between the new masters of the universe in Silicon Valley and the advocates of the common people, of the little man, of the common man in America. This is a very spurious alliance, but there are some of those in Donald Trump's cabinet that embody perfectly that fusion, that mix between the ultimate technocratic power, the Peter Thiels, the Mark Zuckerberg, the titans of the digital world in Silicon Valley, who happen to be actually careful readers of Carl Schmitt, of Leo Strauss, of René Girard. We shouldn't underestimate them. They knew how to look into the weakness of the liberal order by drawing from some important thinkers. So this is what I think is part of the new Catholic moment in the United States, and Catholicism is part of that, not just because a high proportion of the members of Trump's cabinet are Catholic, but also because there is a centrality that Catholicism has acquired in American politics, in American culture, that is slowly becoming the substitute, is succeeding, is substituting what was Protestant culture. It's an incredibly important change in American history, a country founded by Protestants. Now the most influential thinkers are not Protestants, not evangelicals, they are Catholic. So this is in some sense our problem as Catholics, my problem, because this is changing not just America in ways that we cannot know now, but it's changing Catholicism in some sense. It's not just a PR problem, a problem of perception and of reputation, but it's a problem that when something like this happens in a country like America, it changes some genes, the DNA of such a vital church, incredibly vital in terms of militancy, of vocations, of money, of intuition, of entrepreneurship. It's an incredibly vital church. Let's not underestimate US Catholicism. So, what are Catholics doing about this? Saying about this? Well, you have some individual voices that have issued protests against the deportation policies. At the national level, not much has happened. There's no comparison between the national campaign that was launched against Obamacare, which was really seen as a national emergency. We haven't seen this under Donald Trump. Why? Because this is a church that is afraid. It's intimidated. Intimidation works. Intimidation works against individuals, against institutions. So here you have a few voices that have been openly critical and some other voices that have been much more enthusiastic about this, much more positive, much more encouraging, and actually praising the Trump administration for its policies, especially on gender, on transgender. One of these voices has been the one of the bishop and founder of the website and multimedia publishing house Word on Fire, Bishop Robert Barron, former bishop of Tyler, Texas, Joseph Strickland, who was removed by Pope Francis in 2023 after a visitation of his diocese. The group called Catholics for Catholics that organized a paraliturgy at Trump's residence at Mar-a-Lago. You can Google that and saw some pictures, but I advise against that, honestly. And then Donald Trump has created a presidential task force on the freedom of religion that has appointed some Catholic bishops in that list of mostly Christian and some Jewish leaders here. So these are just a few things that have happened, but I think we are in a more subtle and more interesting kind of Catholic moment. Why? Because what has happened now is the fruit of some deep changes in the theological culture of American Catholicism, especially in political theology. So there has been, since the 1990s, a slow process of criticism and ultimately, I think, of undermining the legitimacy of the constitutional system of the liberal order. I'm sure you have heard of the radical orthodoxy. It's one of those things that generates some ideas and some voices that in the end lead to a constitutional system that is without advocates, without defenders. in political theology in the United States, we are in an interesting Catholic moment because the election of Pope Leo XIV has coincided with what a very prominent Dominican, Thomas Joseph White, the first American rector of the Pontifical University of Thomas Aquinas in Rome, also known as the Angelicum, called just 5 days after the election of Pope Leo. He published in First Things an article titled A Leonine Revival. Just like Leo XIII was not just the Pope of Rerum Novarum, but also the Pope of the Thomistic revival. So there are high expectations from Pope Leo XIV that he will introduce a return of Thomistic theology. It's very interesting that, so this is coming from a pontifical university in Rome led by an American Dominican in Rome. So there is really a new Catholic moment coming from the United States. So here, and I'm coming close to my conclusion, I think we have to take a hard look at what's happening in America, in American Catholicism, because it's not just about America. As you know, we are now in a much more interconnected global world, meaning also a church of believers without borders. The internet knows no borders. Many people learn or unlearn theology on the internet, and there's no border against that. And so what happens there with a certain radicality and a very intimate relationship with politics now under Donald Trump is something that should ask of us some hard questions. So first, I think we have to be courageous and take a look at what is the end of the Catholic mainstream. That everybody was supposed to be, in their own way, a Vatican II Catholic. A little bit more on the right or left, but everyone was in that stream, mainstream. No, now there are many streams. And this is really a much more complicated picture. We have to take stock and to be self-critical, I think, as theologians, of what has been the result of, 40, 50 years of postmodernist, anti-institutional, post-institutional visions of the church. Now institutions are still there, but they are being occupied by someone who, guess what? They do believe in institutions because they are occupying that. This means the emergence of different kinds of voices. I come from a tradition of studies on the Second Vatican Council which was centered on the role of the bishops. And in the 60s, that was seen as a great conquest of the progressive theology. Bishops now in America, they count, I wouldn't say for nothing, but much, much less than we assume. So we have different kinds of voices. Self-appointed watchdogs, self-appointed prophets. It's not a church that is in the hands of the bishops or of the Vatican. We see, and this is a huge problem, AI, technology, all of that, we see in America especially a radical process of deculturation of Catholicism. Everything is about sound bites, 2 minutes videos, and that's the whole theology you need to know to fight against the enemies. We have a crisis of the universities in the production of knowledge. The universities are no longer the most important place where knowledge is produced. They are coexisting with other places. And this is true also for theology. Theology in academia is no longer running the show. We have a voicelessness of theology in America compared to religious studies. Everything that is supposed to be sexy and funny now, there, has to be about lived religion, material culture, all of that. Theology, meaning systematic, scripture and so on, is not sexy and funny. But guess what? Some people do believe that it counts to study Carl Schmitt or to counter Metz, and they're running the show now. There is a dominance of a political theology that is much more political theory than theology. But guess what? Some people do believe that theology has to do with God, and when they say the will of the people is the will of God, they do political theology. But on the other side, we have become naked and defenseless because we don't believe in political theology anymore. So here, I think there has to be, and I don't want to be a depressing kind of downer speaker that you will jump in the river, okay? But there has to be a hard look at what happens there, because it's not enough to judge and to be worried about what's happening in what could be the death of American democracy and of the death of a certain democratic Catholic culture. We have to take a look at what happened there, what have been the weaknesses, the vacuums that have been filled by some voices, and we should try and fill that vacuum in a different way. So here, I don't know what to expect of the future of America and of the Catholic Church. I do believe that there is an incredible vitality in US Catholicism, but there is now an asymmetry between voices who do believe that there is a religious theological argument to be made in the public square, and they have captured the executive power, and by and large, in many places, the judicial power. And there is much less confidence on the other side, which would be my side, that we have a credible argument to make. This has to be a self-critical moment. It's hard, but there's still time. But this time would be wasted if we just stop at lamenting how bad some characters are. Yes, I totally agree with that. It's a grotesque show to see how some people are deported in violation of the Constitution, of the law. We could spend a lot of time with these horror stories. But there is an argument which is theological and religious to understand what's happening and what can be done to counter that. Two last things. One, I don't think we should realistically hope that the first Pope from the United States will solve the problems of the United States, or the problems of Europe dealing with the United States even less. And second, the sheer numbers tell us that US Catholicism is still a superpower in global Catholicism. We should not ignore that. We ignore that at our own risk. It's a power to reckon with, to understand, and to know that it's a very important piece of the global Catholic picture that will not go away when Trump goes away. It will remain because, as I said, America has a religious understanding of itself. And Trump has given, in a very warped and vicious way, back faith, not Christian faith, but faith in themselves, in some kind of themselves. And this is a theological problem that I think it's also our problem here. I'm going to stop here. Thank you for your patience, and I'm really looking forward to your questions and comments. Thank you.